The sharp screech of the subway brakes echoed through the underground station, sending a cold gust of air rushing through the tunnel. The doors slid open, and a flood of passengers hurried out, each lost in their own world, moving with a sense of purpose and urgency. Robert Bobby Carter, 42 years old, was once a Marine, but a roadside bomb on the battlefield took away his legs. Returning from war, he faced a different kind of battle: society's indifference. The medals pinned to his worn-out military jacket didn't secure him a decent job, didn't shield him from pitying looks, and certainly didn't make navigating a city designed for the able-bodied any easier. He never complained about it. But today was different. Today, resting firmly in his lap, he held a wooden box, a treasure carrying a promise that needed to be fulfilled. Beside him, Daniel Dan Hargrove, 45, a former paratrooper, had once been an elite sharpshooter in classified operations across the Middle East. He had been lucky enough to leave the battlefield without any severe physical injuries, but the war never really left him. Sleepless nights, haunting memories, the faces of fallen comrades. These were the scars he carried. Dan was tall and solidly built, but there was a weariness in his eyes, the look of a man who had seen too much and wished he could forget. Like Bobby, he knew that soldiers who fought for their country were often the ones cast aside the moment they were no longer needed. But today, none of that mattered. They had a mission: to bring home the ashes of their fallen brother, Michael "Mike" Thompson, so he could rest beside his family. Bobby scanned the station, searching for a way down to the exit. He came to an abrupt stop when he saw a cold, impersonal sign taped to the metal elevator doors. "Elevator out of service. We apologize for the inconvenience." He let out a quiet sigh. Not surprising. Dan cursed under his breath, glancing around. No one stopped to help them. The other passengers moved past them without a second glance, absorbed in their own lives, eyes glued to their phones, music blasting through their earbuds. Bobby looked up at Dan and smirked. "Welcome to my world." Dan gritted his teeth and grabbed the handles of the wheelchair. "Hold on to that box. I don't want Mike to have a rough ride." Bobby tightened his grip on the wooden urn against his chest and gave a nod. Dan lowered himself, braced his legs, and lifted the wheelchair onto the first step, the second step, the third. Bobby could feel every shift and jolt, but he didn't complain, didn't flinch. They had made it through worse terrains than this, only now the battlefield was different. The people around them continued walking as if they didn't exist. A businessman in a suit gave them a quick glance before turning away, dragging his suitcase faster. A young woman clutched her purse tighter, as if they were a threat. A teenage boy nearby seemed about to offer help, but then hesitated, pulled his hands back, and walked away. Dan didn't need anyone's pity. But one bitter thought flickered in his mind. Is this really how the country treats its veterans? Dan set the wheelchair down on the cold tiled floor. He took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. Bobby still held the wooden box tightly, his expression weary but unshaken. Dan rested his hands on his knees, exhaling. "If this happens again, I'm making you walk." Bobby let out a dry chuckle, his voice laced with sarcasm. "Yeah? As if I have a choice." They adjusted themselves, took another breath, and rolled forward into the sea of strangers. In Bobby's lap, the urn containing Michael "Mike" Thompson's ashes remained clutched tightly, a reminder of a promise they never intended to break. Bobby's wheelchair rolled slowly across the cold subway station floor. In his lap, the urn was held tightly, as if loosening his grip even slightly would mean losing an irreplaceable part of his past. But not everyone saw it that way. The moment they merged into the crowd, Bobby could feel the stares, not of compassion or respect, but of suspicion, distance, and discomfort. Nearby, a middle-aged man in a neatly pressed suit, holding a cup of coffee, glanced at them with a cold expression, then leaned toward his companion and whispered, "They look suspicious. What's in that box?" The woman next to him, her hair neatly tied up, wrinkled her nose and muttered, "Probably some homeless guys or beggars." "What kind of people are on the train today?" Bobby gritted his teeth but remained silent. He had heard this too many times before. A group of young men sat on a nearby bench, hoodies pulled over their heads, laughing among themselves. One of them pointed toward Bobby, his voice dripping with mockery. "Hey, check it out, a soldier in a wheelchair. Guess even the military threw him away." Another one snorted, half joking, half serious. "I thought veterans had housing. Why is he still hanging around here?" Dan stopped in his tracks, turning to stare at them. His piercing gaze made them flinch, their laughter dying down as they quickly looked away, pretending to be distracted by their phones. Bobby took a deep breath, his fingers tightening around the wooden urn. Those words didn't hurt him anymore, but they still cut into something deep inside. He had fought for this country. He had stood on the battlefield, risking his life for these people, the same people who now refused to even acknowledge his humanity. A young woman in an expensive coat, engrossed in her phone, glanced up just as Bobby and Dan passed by. Her reaction was instantaneous. She clutched her designer handbag tightly, pulling it close, her expression wary, as if the two veterans posed some kind of threat. She took a small step back and whispered to her companion, "They look scary." You never know with these ex-military types. The man walking beside her, a sharply dressed office worker, lowered his voice, but not enough for Dan to miss. "Aren't a lot of them PTSD cases? Look at that one. He looks like he could snap any second." Bobby let out a soft chuckle, but there was no humor in it. He was used to this. Dan clenched his fists, but then exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. He leaned in toward Bobby and muttered, "You see that? A guy in a wheelchair and an old soldier. Must be a criminal organization." Bobby glanced at Dan, then smirked, but not because it was funny. Because it was all too familiar. They kept moving forward, ignoring the murmurs, ignoring the stares, but in Bobby's lap, the wooden urn felt heavier than ever, not just because it carried Mike's ashes, but because it carried the weight of judgment, neglect, and the indifference of a country they once fought for. Dan suddenly murmured, his voice low but tinged with bitterness, "I swear, if Mike were here to see this, he'd lose his damn mind." Bobby nodded slowly, his eyes cold as steel. "That's why we have to get him home, so he doesn't have to see any of this." The crowd continued moving, passing by them as if they had never existed at all. Conflict with the subway security guards. The loudspeaker blared through the crowded subway station, drowning out all other noise. "Train number 4 has arrived. Passengers, please move quickly to avoid congestion." Bobby and Dan remained seated, not in a hurry, but as the flood of people rushed past them, 2 uniformed security guards moved with purpose, walking straight toward them like predators closing in on their prey. The taller of the two, a broad-shouldered man with a square jaw and cold, unreadable eyes, came to a halt right in front of Bobby. His navy blue uniform was pressed so perfectly it seemed like a second skin. Bobby felt it immediately. Something wasn't right. He had faced abuse of power before, and he recognized that look. The look of someone who didn't need a reason to doubt him. "Excuse me, but we need to check that box," the tall guard said, his voice dry and filled with suspicion. Bobby's grip tightened around the urn, his fingers pressing into the wood as if he could shield it from the world. "This is the ashes of our fallen comrade." Bobby's voice was steady, calm but unyielding. "We have every right to carry it with us." "Oh," another voice joined in, laced with mockery and condescension. The second guard, shorter, with a buzz cut and a permanent smirk, stepped closer, folding his arms across his chest. His gaze ran over Bobby like he was appraising a piece of cheap furniture. "A veteran, huh?" He cocked his head, eyes flicking toward Bobby's faded military jacket. "I thought guys like you were supposed to be taken care of by the government." Dan shot up from his seat, his eyes flashing with fury, stepping forward until he was just inches away from the smirking guard. "What the hell did you just say?" Dan's voice was low, the kind of low that came before something dangerous happened, but the guard didn't back down. Instead, he grinned, his gaze taunting. "Relax, old man. I'm just doing my job." His eyes dropped back to the box on Bobby's lap. He took a step forward, standing so close now that Bobby could smell the faint scent of stale coffee on his breath. "We don't know what's in there." The guard's voice lowered slightly, filled with undisguised suspicion. "Could be a weapon, could be drugs. How do we know?" Bobby took a slow, deep breath, holding back the anger burning in his chest. "I just told you." His voice was quiet but sharp as a blade. "It's my friend's ashes." The tall guard scoffed, arms crossed, eyes filled with disbelief. "Yeah? Where's the proof? Got any paperwork?" Dan let out a short, bitter laugh. "You think we're just carrying around fake ashes for fun?" The shorter guard shrugged, putting on a look of mock innocence. "I don't know, but I do know there are rules, and everyone has to follow them." He flicked his fingers toward Bobby. "Take him, for example. He shouldn't be out here alone. If he's really a veteran, shouldn't he be in a care facility or something?" Bobby closed his eyes for a brief second, forcing himself to swallow the bitter frustration welling up inside him. Every time he heard something like this, every time someone saw him as a burden instead of a man, it brought him back to the battlefield, where rank, color, and physical ability didn't matter, where he and Mike had fought side by side as equals. And now, Mike was dead. And Bobby was here, being treated like a criminal for trying to keep a promise. "I don't care who he is." The tall guard shrugged. "I care about what might be in that box." Dan's fists clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Bobby could feel the tension radiating off him. "Listen," Bobby said, keeping his voice measured. "You want paperwork? Here." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn folder. The edges creased from being handled too many times. The shorter guard snatched it from Bobby's hands, flipping through the pages. 1 minute, 2 minutes. Neither of them spoke. Dan stared at him, his eyes practically burning a hole through him. Finally, the guard let out a slow, deliberate exhale, then folded the paperwork back up and tossed it onto Bobby's lap with utter disrespect. "It checks out, but I still need to take a look." He reached forward, fingers about to touch the urn. But before he could, a strong hand wrapped tightly around his wrist. It was Dan. His grip was ironclad, his eyes burning with a quiet, deadly rage. "I'm only going to say this once." Dan's voice was low, the kind of low that made men hesitate before stepping into a fight. "If you touch that box without a damn court order, I swear you'll regret it." The guard swallowed, his eyes flickering with uncertainty for the first time. No one moved. The air between them was thick enough to cut with a knife, a standoff where one wrong move could send everything spiraling out of control. Now it was just a matter of who would blink first. The station loudspeaker blared overhead. "Train number 4 will depart in 2 minutes. Passengers, please move quickly." But Bobby and Dan were no longer passengers. They were being forced off the train, dragged out like criminals, like dangerous suspects. "We already explained. This box is nothing but ashes. We have all the damn paperwork." Dan roared, struggling against the grip of the towering security guard. But they didn't care. Bobby felt rough hands grab the handles of his wheelchair, yanking him forward as if he were nothing but an object. "Don't resist," the shorter guard warned, his voice dripping with smug authority. "This is abuse of power," Dan shouted, shaking off the grip of the taller guard and shoving him back a step. A few passengers turned their heads, but no one intervened. Some just pulled out their phones, their eyes filled with hesitation and concern, yet they remained bystanders. They had seen too many incidents like this before. They knew that speaking up wouldn't change a thing. As they were dragged into the security checkpoint, the shorter guard stared at Bobby, then leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a condescending whisper. "You think you're special, just because you used to be a soldier?" Bobby looked up, his gaze sharp as a blade. "I don't think I'm special, but I think Mike deserves respect." The guard scoffed, turning to his partner. "Did you hear that? He really thinks this box is something important." "Yeah, I'm curious too." The taller guard nodded, then suddenly reached down and snatched the urn from Bobby's lap. "No!" Bobby bellowed, lunging forward, but the guard had already yanked the lid open. The box slipped from his grasp. The lid snapped open. Mike's ashes spilled onto the cold subway floor, a fine grey mist scattering in the air before settling onto the dirty ground. The space fell deathly silent. All that remained was Bobby's ragged breathing, Dan's seething rage, and the horrified gasps of the witnesses. A middle-aged woman clutched her chest, eyes wide in disbelief. A man ran a hand over his face, shaking his head as if trying to wake from a nightmare. A younger man pulled out his phone, his voice trembling as he spoke. "Oh my God, they just spilled a soldier's ashes on the ground." Bobby froze. He couldn't breathe. Mike's ashes, his brother's remains, were now smeared across the filthy subway floor. Mike had fought for this country, bled for this country, and now this was where he ended up. Dan grabbed the shorter guard by the collar, shoving him hard enough that he stumbled back against the wall. "What the hell did you just do?" Dan roared, his voice filled with uncontrolled fury. He lunged down, lifting Bobby back into his wheelchair, his hands trembling with rage. "Are you okay?" Dan asked quickly, but Bobby didn't respond. Bobby was staring at the ashes on the ground, his eyes empty yet filled with unbearable pain. Dan turned back, his eyes burning with raw fury, staring directly at the two security guards. "You just dropped the remains of a soldier, a goddamn hero. Do you even realize what you just did? Or do soldiers only matter to you when they're holding a gun?" The shorter guard shrugged, his expression completely devoid of remorse. "We're just following protocol." "Protocol my ass!" Dan bellowed, his rage completely unleashed. An elderly man wearing a veteran's jacket stepped forward, his voice low and ice-cold. "He's right, this isn't protocol. This is abuse." A young woman wiped away tears, looking at the guards with nothing but disgust. "Do you have any shame? Any at all?" The murmurs of outrage spread through the crowd. More people raised their phones, capturing everything. Within minutes, the footage had already started circulating on social media. But Bobby heard none of it. He leaned down, his hands shaking as they gently touched the thin layer of grey dust on the tile floor. Every particle, every piece of Mike. He carefully scooped up what he could, his fingers clenching around the fragile remains as if letting go would mean losing Mike forever. Dan knelt beside him, helping him gather the ashes. No one said a word. The entire room was engulfed in an unbearable silence. Bobby finally looked up, his eyes cold as steel, his voice low and cutting like a knife. "I've seen men like you before." His gaze locked onto the two guards, unwavering, men who hide behind rules to justify their cowardice. He closed the urn, securing it tightly, holding it against his chest like a lifeline. "But there's one thing I know for sure. You are not worthy of standing before a soldier like Mike." And at that moment, no one could argue against it. The truth was laid bare for all to see. A heavy silence hung over the subway platform. Bobby trembled as he picked up what was left of Mike, his hands shaking. But he carefully gathered every last grain of ash, as if letting even one slip through his fingers would mean losing Mike forever. Dan stood frozen, his breathing ragged, his eyes burning with rage so intense it was beyond words. He wasn't yelling anymore. His anger had transcended speech. At first, the passengers around them had only watched in stunned silence. But then shock gave way to fury. "What the hell did they just do?" a middle-aged man shouted, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Did they just spill a soldier's ashes? A man who fought for this country?" A young woman, tears welling in her eyes, clutched her phone as she recorded. A young man in a hoodie and backpack, who had been filming the entire event from the start, rapidly tapped at his phone screen, posting the video online in real time. "This cannot be swept under the rug," he muttered as his friend bit his lip, shaking with silent rage. Within seconds, the video began to spread like wildfire. Comments flooded in. "Unbelievable. They just spilled a soldier's ashes like garbage. How does this country treat its veterans like this? They fought for us, and this is how we repay them?" An elderly woman, small in stature but with fire in her eyes, slowly stepped forward and placed a gentle but firm hand on Bobby's shoulder. "We know you served this country." Her voice was steady but thick with controlled fury. Bobby looked up, his eyes still filled with pain, but he couldn't find the words to respond. The old woman squeezed his shoulder as if trying to pass on her strength. Don't let them disgrace you. This is shameful. A middle-aged man clenched his fists, his body trembling with anger. We can't let this keep happening. Another woman turned to the crowd, her voice shaking with emotion. Everyone here saw what just happened. They are not criminals. They are veterans. They fought for this country. A businessman in a neatly pressed suit stepped forward, pointing directly at the two guards. Do you have any idea what you just did? You just spilled the remains of a soldier, a veteran. A young woman nodded, tears rolling down her cheeks. How many more times will this happen? When will we actually start respecting the people who fought for us? They should be fired on the spot, another man yelled. The murmurs of outrage grew louder and louder, and silence was no longer an option. Some passengers turned toward the ticket booth, shouting, "Get the supervisor out here now! We demand an explanation. This is abuse of power. Who do you think you are?" A woman began live streaming, her voice choking with rage. "This is happening right now at the station. They spilled a soldier's ashes and they haven't even apologized." Just a few blocks away, the subway system's central control room was in chaos. Phones rang non-stop, inboxes overflowed with complaints, and social media pages were flooded with furious comments. A senior security official slammed his hand onto his desk, his face twisted in frustration as he read the angry flood of responses. God damn it, what the hell were those idiots thinking? Immediately, an urgent order was issued. Handle the situation immediately. Minutes later, as tensions on the subway platform reached a boiling point, a man in a dark grey suit walked briskly toward the security area. The subway supervisor had arrived. The tall guard stiffened, while the shorter one took a nervous step back, sensing that things had spiraled out of control. The supervisor glanced at the two security guards, then scanned the entire scene. He saw the spilled ashes on the floor. He saw Bobby clutching the wooden urn, his eyes red with grief. He saw the furious passengers, the phone still recording, the deafening chorus of outrage filling the air. And he knew this situation was beyond damage control. This has gone too far. His voice was sharp and authoritative, his eyes locked onto the two guards. Both security officers froze, clearly realizing that they had pushed things too far. The supervisor stepped forward, looking directly at Bobby. And for the first time that day, his voice wasn't just the detached command of a bureaucrat, it was the voice of someone who recognized a grave mistake. "These men have committed no crime," he said firmly, turning to his security staff. "Let them go." Bobby said nothing. He simply stared at the supervisor, trying to gauge whether this was a genuine acknowledgement of wrongdoing or just damage control to quiet the backlash. But the man's eyes weren't like the two guards. Bobby took a deep breath, glancing at Dan before giving a slow nod. But deep down, he knew this wasn't over yet. The train screeched as it slowed to a stop. But for Bobby and Dan, everything had already stopped long ago. They no longer felt the movement, only a heavy, suffocating weight pressing down on their chests. Bobby still clutched the wooden urn tightly, his knuckles white from the sheer force of his grip. The entire rest of the journey, he hadn't spoken a word, just sat there, staring down at it, as if afraid that if he loosened his hold even for a second, Mike would once again be taken from him. Dan sat across from him, arms crossed, his breathing still uneven, the anger still burning hot inside him. But he knew that right now, the only thing that mattered was finishing this mission, bringing Mike home. Every minute on this train felt longer than any battle. Every slight jolt of the train felt like a knife twisting deeper, reminding them that they had failed to protect Mike when he was alive. But they would not fail him again. Then Bobby felt a hand on his shoulder. He looked up. Dan was staring at him. His eyes were no longer filled with rage, but instead with pain, understanding, and determination. "We're almost there." Dan's voice was hoarse. Bobby nodded slowly, inhaling deeply. As the train doors slid open, a cold wind swept through the station, but it wasn't nearly as cold as the ache in their hearts. Bobby looked up. A woman stood there, her hands clasped tightly together, her eyes red and swollen, yet filled with strength. Mike's mother. Bobby swallowed hard, a lump rising in his throat to red. He had met her once before, the day they all sent Mike off to war. That day, she had held her son tightly, kissed his forehead, and whispered, "I love you. No matter what happens, I'll always be here." Now she was still here, but this time Mike wasn't coming home in her arms. Bobby lifted the wooden urn from his lap, slowly wheeling himself toward her. Mike's mother reached out with trembling hands, and the moment her fingers grazed the smooth wood, she broke down completely. She collapsed to her knees, sobbing, "Mike, my baby." Her voice shattered, her body shaking with grief. Dan stood beside them, head bowed, trying to remain composed. But when Richard Thompson, Mike's father, stepped forward, placing a weathered, trembling hand on the urn, the deep lines on his face quivered slightly, and Bobby knew none of them could hold it in any longer. The old man didn't cry, but his eyes were hollow, empty, like a man who had lost everything. He looked at Bobby, his voice frail yet full of gratitude. "Thank you for bringing my son home." Bobby gritted his teeth, nodding firmly, but he couldn't get any words out, because if he opened his mouth, his emotions would spill out uncontrollably. That evening, in a quiet cemetery on a small hill, Mike finally came home. A gentle breeze rustled through the trees, whispering through the leaves, as if the town itself was welcoming him back. Bobby and Dan stood before the freshly dug grave, beside a newly placed headstone engraved with the name Michael Mike Thompson. Everything was silent. No train station noise, no murmurs from a restless crowd, no judgmental stares. Just family, friends, and the people who truly loved Mike, standing together to lay him to rest. Bobby slowly knelt down, setting the wooden urn before the headstone. His hand ran over the polished lid, as if for one last time he was patting Mike on the shoulder like he used to on the battlefield. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and whispered, "You're home now, Mike." The simple words carried the weight of their entire journey, of a promise fulfilled, and of a grief that would never fade. Mike's mother collapsed onto the urn, clutching it as if she could hug her son one last time. She sobbed uncontrollably, her hands shaking as they caressed the wooden surface. "Thank you. Thank you for keeping your promise. Thank you for not letting him go alone." Mike's father stood beside her, still not crying, but his entire body trembled, as if a part of him had been buried along with his son. Dan stood next to Bobby, his eyes stinging, but he forced himself to keep his voice steady. "We promised we'd bring you home, Mike, and we did." He took a deep breath, his fists clenched so tightly, his knuckles turned white. "But you know what hurts me the most, Mike? It's not losing you. It's how the world treats people like you." Bobby looked up at the headstone, his voice no longer shaking, but strong and resolute. "We won't let them forget what you did. I swear." A soft gust of wind swept through, carrying a single golden leaf gently down onto the wooden urn, like a response, like a goodbye, and like a thank you. The investigation explodes. Justice is served. Within 24 hours of the subway incident going viral, the entire nation erupted in outrage. Major news outlets broadcasted the scandal non-stop. Subway security abuses power, spills disabled veterans' ashes. Public outrage over inhumane treatment of war hero. Who will take responsibility for this injustice? Social media was set on fire. Fire them immediately. This is unforgivable. People like them don't deserve to wear a uniform. If we let this slide, who will be the next victim? The subway authority was forced into an emergency meeting. The two security officers were immediately suspended, but public anger didn't stop there. Bobby and Dan, along with hundreds of veterans and supporters, gathered outside the subway headquarters demanding justice. A high-stakes press conference was called, as the executives responsible for the system faced an unforgiving audience. The head of the subway authority, a middle-aged man in an expensive suit, stood before dozens of microphones, his face tense with anxiety. He took a deep breath before bowing in front of the entire nation. "We acknowledge that this was a severe mistake. We deeply apologize to the family of Michael Thompson, as well as to Mr. Bobby Carter and Mr. Daniel Hargrove." Then he hesitated, his throat visibly dry, desperate to salvage the company's reputation. But Bobby wasn't about to let him off the hook. He stepped forward, eyes cold as steel, grabbed a microphone and spoke clearly. An apology is not enough. The room fell silent. If there was no video, if millions of people hadn't spoken up, would you still be apologizing? The executive froze, mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. We don't need empty words. Bobby continued, his voice firm. We need action. Under immense public pressure, the subway authority was forced to make major decisions. Both security officers were permanently fired and faced a criminal investigation for abuse of power and assault. The supervising officer was demoted and forced to publicly take responsibility. A comprehensive reform policy was enacted, requiring all subway security personnel to undergo specialized training on how to treat veterans and disabled passengers with dignity. Bobby and Dan were invited to join an advisory committee overseeing the implementation of these reforms. During a public disciplinary hearing, the two security guards were forced to face Bobby and Dan. The shorter officer, the one who had mocked Bobby, kept his head down, sweat dripping from his forehead. I didn't mean, he stammered, his voice shaking. Dan let out a cold laugh, his gaze piercing. Didn't mean to. So when you laughed at us on that platform, was that an accident too? The man swallowed hard, unable to respond. The taller guard, the one who had tipped Bobby's wheelchair, gritted his teeth, trying to maintain his composure. But his fear was obvious. Bobby locked eyes with him, his voice low but sharp as a knife. I don't need your apology. I just hope you remember this day, because next time, if anyone else is treated like I was, this country will not stay silent. The crowd outside the courthouse erupted in cheers. For the first time, Bobby felt the weight in his heart lighten, just a little. Following the scandal, Bobby's campaign gained unstoppable momentum, drawing support from veterans organizations, politicians, and millions of everyday citizens. New legislation was proposed, mandating that all public transportation systems provide proper accessibility for disabled veterans, including fully operational elevators and ramps. The government pledged increased veteran support, offering more legal protection and benefits. Security training programs were revamped, incorporating first-hand instruction from veterans like Bobby and Dan. At a public event honoring his efforts, Bobby stood on stage, looking out at the massive crowd of people who now stood behind him. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and whispered, "Mike, we did it." A soft gust of wind blew past, carrying a small autumn leaf that gently landed in his hand. Dan clapped Bobby on the shoulder, grinning a rare, genuine smile. "So, what's next, soldier?" Bobby looked up at the sky, at the golden sunset stretching over the city they had just fought to change. He smiled, not with bitterness, but with hope. "We keep going, Dan. There's still more work to do." And this time, they weren't fighting alone anymore. They had an entire generation standing behind them, ready to fight for a better future.